Hi, my name is Tony Rose, and I'm a fortunate individual who started going to sea at age 19 in 1961. And I finally retired from a work environment concerning marine engineering in a small fleet of government vessels at the Naval Dockyard in Esquimalt. So I had a decades-long career, which was very rewarding and certainly very interesting. It was full of many events, some of which were absolutely terrifying and some of which were very rewarding. And I'm very fortunate to have lived that life, and I feel very enriched by it. So thanks for watching the video. I started my seagoing career in June of 1961 aboard the federal government icebreaker, Department of Transport icebreaker called the Camsell. My first trip to sea was 4 months into the Western Arctic. And it was a real eye-opener going right out of high school right onto a government icebreaker. And this was before Coast Guard was formed. It was just Department of Transport, it was called at the time. Coast Guard did not come along until 1963. And I did 3 consecutive summer trips on the Camsell, 61, 62, and 63. And that was the beginning of my seagoing career. When I started my career on the icebreaker Camsell, there was an engineer on there who had to take the rather outspoken, otherwise known as mouthy kid, under his wing and get him to stop talking so much and listen. And he was a serious mentor to me for years to come and vessels in my future. And his name was Graham Nelson. And he was an absolutely awesome mentor. I didn't care for the man very much at first, but then years later, I realized he was one of the best friends I ever had in my life. And I ended up worshiping the ground he walked on. Yeah, after I left the Coast Guard in 1971, in the 1972-73 shipping seasons in the Arctic, I found myself as a second engineer on a river tug on the Mackenzie River. And the season started, you went up there before breakup of the ice and the lake and the river up to Hay River and do refit work. And whilst I was working on the tug, doing work to get that ready for the coming season, there was a barge sitting in the water alongside the tug, which was sitting ashore on ways. They pulled them out of the water in the winter. The barge was frozen in there for the winter. And there were 2 men working on the barge, and it was a fuel barge with what you call retane from JP4 jet fuel. And they didn't do the right thing, and they were using a diesel engine driven pump to strip out the retane so refit work could begin on the barge. And they did something stupid. When they were priming the pump, they used a bucket of jet fuel instead of water. And when they started the pump, the priming plug wasn't in properly, so it leaked and it sprayed the liquid over the muffler on the diesel driven pump. It caught fire. They were about 6 or 8 feet from an open manhole with jet fumes, and you can imagine the result. The barge blew up, killed them. I'm on my hands and knees. I saw the fumes started panting out the open manhole, going whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. And I knew what was coming. I could see the deck of the barge bulging every time it panted. So I ran down the starboard side of the deckhouse in the tug to put the deckhouse between me and the barge, got down on my hands and knees with my hands over my head like this, and the barge blew up. The first 2 tanks, the second 2 tanks, and the third set of 2 tanks, and it just shredded the barge. It blew them into the river and killed them. And I couldn't hear anything for 3 days. And to this very day, my ears are damaged from that explosion. So that was one of the exciting points of my career. And I was the last guy to see them alive, so I had to go to the inquiry and all that in Hay River. And then the second year up there in Hay River, I became the assistant engineer superintendent based in Inuvik. So I spent the whole 1973 shipping season up in Inuvik as the assistant shore engineer, which was an interesting, very interesting part of my career. So, yeah. During my career, I was fortunate, very fortunate, to be exposed to, well, diesel electric propelled vessels, Steam propelled vessels. The best ship I worked on, as far as I'm concerned, in my whole career was built the same year as the Titanic, and it was the lighthouse tender Estevan. I just loved that vessel. I was fortunate enough to be fourth engineer on there. Then I was exposed to turboelectric weather ship. I ended up on some Norwegian ships with very large, slow turning diesel engines burning bunker fuel. The only thing I didn't get exposed to was gas turbines or nuclear. But I had a very large variety of machinery I was exposed to, and I consider myself very fortunate to have had all that experience. I was fortunate that when I was a junior engineer on the weather ship Quadra, we had a relief second engineer came aboard, and I was about 26 years old, I guess, at the time. And there was a position on a lighthouse tender called the Alexander Mackenzie as second engineer came open up in Prince Rupert, and he leaned on me to apply for the job, which I did. And when I was second engineer on the Alexander Mackenzie in Rupert, the chief engineer was retiring, and it was just at the time Coast Guard College was being thought of, and I got one of the last two scholarships to go to vocational school to get my second class motor. And 6 months later, I went back to Prince Rupert after passing my second motor. I already had a third steam end motor. Anyway, I had my second motor, and I went back to Prince Rupert and took over as chief engineer on the Alexander Mackenzie. And this was the last position I held in Canadian Coast Guard as an engineering officer before I moved on elsewhere. In the mid-60s, in the middle of my Coast Guard career, I decided, after I'd been socializing with crew members from Norwegian ships that were berthed at Ogden Point in Victoria Harbor, I went aboard a couple of their ships and realized that they had engines in those ships that we had none of on this coast. And I knew that engineering exams are based on that kind of machinery. So I took myself to the Norwegian consulate in Vancouver and talked my way onto a Norwegian ship as an oiler. And I was soon promoted to a motorman, like a junior engineer. But anyway, I stayed on that ship for a year, came home for a month, and signed on a second ship a Norwegian ship that I was aboard for 14 months. And then I came home and wrote my fourth class motor based on my experience in those deep sea ships. It was the smartest thing I did in my whole career, because a lot of the examination questions were based on machinery of that type, which we had none of on this coast, and none around Victoria at all, where I grew up and lived most of my life. And and I to keep myself, fit in with the Norwegian environment on board those ships. I made it my business to learn to speak Norwegian, and after about a year, I was fairly fluent in it. And at one point in the second ship I was on, the second engineer on the 4 to 8 watch, and I was the motorman on the 4 to 8 watch, or junior engineer. He would tell me in Norwegian what he wanted the Spaniards, who were part of the crew, the day workers, to do for the day work. He'd tell me in Norwegian what he wanted, and I would tell them in English what was to be done. I had a great career for 2.5 years, almost 2.5 years with the Norwegians. I'll never forget it. And I'm forever grateful to them for teaching me what I needed to pass my engineering exams. I've never failed a marine engineering exam. My career included, after I'd been chief engineer on the Alexander Mackenzie for about, I don't know, a year and a half, I guess, I decided I'd had enough of Coast Guard. I wasn't exactly getting along with some of the people in the bridge, and I decided to end my career with Coast Guard about 1971, I guess it was 71, 72, somewhere in there, and came back to Victoria from Prince Rupert. And I got involved with converting the historic tug Sea Lion from a tugboat to a yacht. And then I was the engineer on it when Harold Elworthy, the founder of Island Tug and Barge, took himself and 12 of his friends, 10 of his friends, on a month's cruise, and I was the engineer on it, and made several connections with the people that were aboard as guests, including the founder of Capital Iron and Metals. Old Morris Green was one of them. And anyway, I ended up working for, after that, there was no more runs with the Sea Line. So I ended up working with BC Ferries for a bit, but I was always interested in the tugboat industry. So after a while, I managed to make a connection in Seaspan International, got hired on there as an engineer, and got laid off after a year and a half, 2 years. Went back to BC Ferries briefly on Salt Spring Island for a year and a half, then back to Seaspan. My career with Seaspan International was a total of 30 years. I retired from Seaspan International in 2004. People at Point Hope Shipyard knew that I had left Seaspan, and they needed somebody to oversee the refit in the Department of National Defense vessel from the Noose Bay. And my phone rang. And was I interested in taking on this temporary job as a sort of project manager, overseeing all the trades in the shipyard to put the vessel back together and do the sea trials. And the engineer superintendent that came from the Noose Bay, we did sea trials together, and he asked me what was I going to do after the Stikine was out of the yard. I said, well, I didn't know. I didn't have anything. Did I want to work for him up in the Noose Bay? No, I'd rather be at Dockyard in Esquimalt. And he looked at a phone call. There was nothing at that time. He said, I was told, put my name in at jobs.gca, the federal government site there. And 18 months later, the phone rang. And this was like 2009. And said, first I thought it was a scam phone call, and I hung up on him. Well, then he phoned back and said, Mr. Rose, this is Captain so-and-so, the Naval Dockyard Auxiliary Fleet. We're interested in hiring you. Oh, should I come for an interview? No, we know who you are. Just come and sign the papers. And 10 years later, I was the engineer superintendent after working my way up through the fleet at the Naval Dockyard in the auxiliary fleet. That'd be the tugs, the fireboat, the steam crane, the steam-powered pumping barge, etc., because I had a combined second-class motor and third-class steam, so I could run anything they had in the fleet. So I ended up eventually becoming the engineer superintendent. And after 12 years there, due to medical reasons, I finally had to retire from the dockyard in May 2021. During my second part of my time with BC Ferries, I was based in the terminal at Long Harbor on Salt Spring Island, and I needed a place to live. So the motor yacht that I owned at the time was a 32-footer built in 1930 called the Nomad. And I took that up to Ganges and put it there at the government dock. And I soon found that a 32-foot boat was too small to live on. It didn't have a shower. It didn't have much of anything. So I started looking around for, you need at least a 40-foot boat to live on. So I started looking around, and I found this really neat looking old boat called the Faranda, which turned out was built in 1937, and it was 40 feet. And wonder of wonders, it actually had a shower on board. And I thought, okay, that was it, as long as it had a shower. So I purchased the Faranda in, I think it was July of 1975, and took it up to Ganges. And I worked for BC Ferries that time for about 14 or 18 months before I went back to Seaspan International for the next 28 years. But I kept the Faranda, and I stayed living on it at West Bay Marina down on the Vic West there, Victoria Harbor, and came to realize that, okay, the boat needed some restoration work because it was from 1937. And I found a really good shipwright named Mark Wallace. And I didn't like the things like the wheelhouse doors. I had them made to a teak with brass portholes and all the right fittings. And I had things that had been done wrong to the vessel during its life, I had done in a period applicable manner to when the vessel was designed and built. And like I say, I stayed living aboard it for a total of 8 years. And then my total ownership of the vessel was 42 years. because when I was on my time off from the tugboats that I was working on at Seaspan, I would sometimes take the Faranda and put it in front of the Empress Hotel and use it as a social connection tool. This was before they put locked gates on all the ramps and all the marinas around. But the Faranda became its own project, and it ended up on the front cover of Pacific Yachting. I think it's October 2003. And there was a story in West Coast Mariner about me and the Faranda, and went to the Classic Boat Festival for many years. Won Best Restored Power one year, and all that sort of thing. But it was bought as a well, almost a tool for someplace to live, but then it became a whole lifestyle. And most people don't live aboard a boat for more than 1 year. It's rare for only about 10% of people get past a year living on a boat. I made it for 8 years, but I kept the boat for 42 years. And then I gave it to friends about 5 or 6 years ago, I think it was. And I still have a set of keys. I used the Faranda last August for a few days. So I still connected with it, and I'm still a consultant in the background. They have made changes to the vessel. They are modernizing it, but it's going to be around, well, it'll be 100 years old in 2037. So it's really a cool old heritage vessel that I think has a great future, because the people that have it now have lots of resources and interest in keeping it going. All in all, I consider myself to be one of the most fortunate people who's been involved in a marine engineering career and working in the marine environment, because I've seen so many places. I mean, the first Norwegian ship I was on took me to London, New York, and Tokyo, all within 12 months. I've survived, a grounding of the cam cell in 1962, ran up on a bloody rock, and there was that. And then I told you about the Hay River barge explosion. I've had other things in my career in the tugboat industry. There were all sorts of hair-raising episodes happened there. And I'm just so fortunate and so gratified that I came out of it in the end. I've got all my, limbs, I've got all my faculties, and I consider myself to be very, very lucky, and I'm very gratified, and I don't regret a moment of it.